Hi everyone, I'm Hita Krishnan. I am an assistant professor at the Institute for Global Sustainable Development at the University of Warwick in the UK. I'm also visiting faculty here at Azim Premji University. I'm chatting with my longtime friend and collaborator and partner in many crimes including dog adoption, Seema Mundoli, who is an associate professor here at Azim Premji University. Seema and I have worked together on various issues related to commons for over a decade now, I guess. And yeah, it's just fun to be chatting with you today. So thank you.
Lovely as well, Hita, to do this officially chat with you. Yes.
Yeah. So Seema, I just wanted to start off with asking you. So you've got a master's in finance, an MBA. No, business administration.
Yeah. So I have a post graduation in business administration.
Yes. So how did this transition to ecology come about? Why? What made you go there?
I grew up in a small town, Vishakhapatnam, in a very natural environment with the sea on my back door, literally. And I was always interested in nature. But when you grow up in a small town, your options become very limited. You think only in terms of engineering, medicine, or MBA or business administration. So since I sucked at science and math, I opted for to doing business administration in the hope that I will earn a lot of money, and by the time of 35, I will. It's true. By the time of 35, I will retire and do what I really want to do, which was working with animals.
Okay.
But so after I did my PGTBA, I worked for around 4 years in the corporate sector.
Yeah.
But while working in the corporate sector, I had also started volunteering in the weekends, Saturdays and Sundays, with the Madras Crocodile Bank Trust in Chennai.
Right.
And that was the advantage of the corporate sector, that it was a 5-day week at that time. So we could spend the weekend doing what we really wanted to. So at some point, I felt that, I don't want to wait to be 35. This is what I'm passionate about, and I should just take that leap of faith and start doing something that I'm really interested in, which at that point of time was conservation and ecology related work.
Yeah.
And Croc Bank had a projects coordinator position open. So when that was available, I just took the opportunity when they offered it and jumped ship from corporate to the conservation and ecology sector.
Yeah.
And from there, it has been in different organizations.
Right. So how did the shift from draping reticulated pythons around your neck happen to urban ecology?
At Croc,
Where you don't get reticulated pythons around your neck.
you don't get reticulated pythons. But there are snakes in urban settings.
Yes.
So at the Croc Bank, the kind of work we had to, it was a very small team.
Yeah.
So we did all different kinds of things. Like I would do farm filing to taking care of accounts, signing vouchers, taking care of the crocodiles and the snakes and the turtles, helping with their incubation experiments. So that's where the reticulated python also comes in, which you mentioned. We used to do a lot of show and tell with students and organizations. And I worked in the Croc Bank for about 2.5 years. And I realized that if you wanted to continue in that ecology and conservation space, you have to have something like a PhD or make a higher education, in that sense. And I did not have the background in terms of education to do an ecology.
At the time, it would have been disciplinary.
Yeah, it was very disciplinary. Also, while I was working with the Croc Bank is when I was introduced to the idea that, ecology is not ecology by itself. There's a lot of people involved in it. I remember this very stark moment when I realized that the relationship between ecology and people was, we used to have these awareness programs during December when the turtle nesting season was in Chennai. We would take the van with telling people don't collect the eggs, protect the turtles and things like that, and to the villages on the shores of Chennai. And people were just to tell the villagers, make them aware about it. But one day we went to this in the village, we went to this family of extremely poor Irulas who lived in a ramshackle plastic tarpaulin under a tarpaulin sheet, and they collected eggs because they were so poor that was a source of protein for them.
Right.
So that for me was like a very a bit of a shattering moment, because here I am advocating for protection of species, but there were so many people who were actually dependent on and who are not even the cause of species extinction, actually who are dependent on this for mere survival. So from there, when I was working in Krokbang in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands especially, began to see the relationship between communities and environment. So it all came together in the sense that I knew that conservation alone cannot be my future. It's not something I'm looking at. I wanted to work with people also centered as part of conservation. And then I went to spend about 9-10 months in a collective in Andhra called Timbuktu, where they were working with natural resource management. They were actually natural regeneration in a very dry, arid landscape. And their work was also very, very inspiring. From there, I worked in another organization in the Eastern Ghats looking at tribal communities, their forest rights, land and forest rights, the lobbies against mining, because there was a lot of bauxite mining that was going to happen in the Eastern Ghats, and also education of the Adivasi communities, because the mainstream education really did not seem to make sense in their context.
Way of life.
So this was going on, and I worked about 12 years, and at that point I decided to take a break because I was kind of exhausted. My health had taken a beating with all the field work, and I knew folks who were here at the university. And one of them suggested, why don't you join the MA development program here? So I joined here in the second batch of the MA development program. This was 2012 to 2014. And in 2013, when one of the components of the MA development program is to do a summer internship and a winter field project.
That's where we met, right?
Yes, so that's where we met in 2013, because I had reached out and said, I want to work on something in the urban context, but something that related to ecology and environment. And that's how we met. I remember the long walk around Belandur Lake, exhausting walk around Belandur Lake to understand Bangalore water body. That was literally the first introduction. And since then, I've been working on different aspects of urban ecology, commons, what do people make of nature in the city with Harini, you, and several others in the School of Climate Change and Sustainability.
Nice. When you were talking about turtle eggs, I was reminded of Rob McFarlane's latest book, which is A River Alive? And he works with Yuvan Evers in that. So I listened to the Audible, the Spotify audiobook. And if there is anything better than reading what he has written, it is listening to him narrate.
Yes.
But he talks about actually the work that these people in Chennai go about doing, collecting eggs and then preparing nesting sites for the turtles and so on and so forth. So it just it's been a long process, looks like.
Talking about probably the Student Seek Turtle Conservation Network, that is very iconic because it started as a volunteer movement and continues as a volunteer movement today, and has probably been the introductory phase for so many people into conservation. It still goes on. They do collect the eggs, they engage with fishermen. So
yes, true. And that's also part of the heritage they bring to the next generation, right? This thing of people, human, whatever, nature.
Connections.
Yeah. But again, talking a bit about urban heritage, I remember going to that Dodgubi Lake with you and Harini, I think. And both of us, basically, all three of us, trying to throw stones at tamarind trees and get
tamarind.
And staining our clothes with mud when we tried to climb up the Begur Fort and all of that. Both Harini and I were in white that day. But I think a lot of the work that we've been doing is around heritage of some kind. And so I thought I'd start with that question. What does heritage mean to you personally?
So again, till I started the work in Bangalore, heritage to me meant these places you visited during the holidays with your parents.
Buildings.
Buildings. You know, you go to I remember I had a project in my 8th standard on the temples of Puri and, in Orissa. And I went with my father, took us there. So it was all essentially about built structures. You go to Delhi, you have to see the Humayun's tomb, Taj Mahal, etc. But it is after I started the urban work, and I have to say this, and I say this to a lot of my students also, that when I came to Bangalore, initially I did not, I came here in 2007 and I actually started work in the urban context only in 2013. So that period in between was a time I particularly did not like Bangalore because it was very alien to me. I hadn't grown up here. There was nothing to connect me with it. I was still working in
Still there are conversations about Bangalore and Vizag.
Yeah, so the city I grew up in was for me the most beautiful city in the world, like for most people it is. But I think that interest and connection with history and heritage came after we started the urban work. Because whatever we were looking at that point of time was not purely either a building or either nature. We were looking at it from both elements. How is this nature? What is the historical context of this nature, and how has it influenced Bangalore? And in turn, how people relate to nature.
Yeah.
So, and one of the things that changed for me at that point of time, I know very clearly, is that I began to like Bangalore. Because say I'm sitting in a bus and I'm traveling from one end of the city to another, I began to remember places. Oh, this is the site. This is the Kantarva Stadium, which was the Sampangi Lake. Oh, Majestic was a lake before. It is the Dharmabuddhi Lake. So that connection made me more interested in the city. I began to see it in a more personal and that historical sense gave me a sense of, greater interest in the city itself.
So before this conversation, I was talking to Sudhira, and one of the things that Sudhira did was to traverse the length. So there was a paper I was also involved in it at a much later stage of development and all of that. But Vanessa and Sudhira from Sheffield, they traversed the length of the pipeline, the first pipeline that was ever laid.
The paper.
Yeah. So, and he was talking about how this idea of heritage is pretty much related to the value of that space in the present. So, and as you're talking, that's also something that is coming through, that heritage is not something that is an ancient artifact. It is produced because of the specific interaction that we have with it in the present. But again, when you look at most literature on heritage, at least the mainstream literature, not obviously the more critical side of things, it tends to present heritage as something of the past, something that's ancient, something that is unchanging,
still in time there, yeah.
Still in time, and we are going and we don't have any interaction with it.
True.
Right? And I was just thinking, your work with the Gundatops, for example, represents something that is completely, it's mobile. There are constantly changing interactions. They cut down the trees for a festival, new trees are planted. They take the fruits. Again, new things happen. So, and the reason for which the fruits are taken are very different each time. So, it's a constant remaking and sort of undoing of history and the redoing of it in some sense. And I was just kind of thinking, what are your thoughts around those kinds of things? So, we talk about your work with the Gundatops a little bit and then jump into that.
Yeah, sure. Happy to talk about Gundatops and show you. But also interesting that you point out about how history is not static, because just now I was mentioning things like Dharmabuddhi and Sampangi Lake. They don't even exist.
Yes.
Right? No, they're not even there.
Yeah.
But for us who have been involved with looking at ecology from a historical perspective, they're very much there in our minds.
Yes.
So that's something that I find really interesting, that has changed in the way I think about history. It's not something that is visible always. It's also a memory that we are aware of now. So when it comes to the Gundatops, so if just a very quick introduction of what Gundatops are for people who may not really have heard of the term. So these were wooded groves that are said to have been planted during the time of Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan, or before also. There are records, archival records, which show that these were spread across Karnataka, and they were ideally groves that were where certain species of trees that provided fruit, timber, fodder were planted by the villagers. So it would be mango, jamun, certain species of fig,
medicinal
trees. They all have some medicinal material value. And the idea was that at that point of time, whenever the village had a need for some produce, they would take it from the Gundatop. So if the temple needed renovation, the Chanbog and the Gauda, who were at that time the caste-based hierarchical positions in the village, they would say, okay, we'll cut that tree and use the wood for some temple renovation. Or if there was a family that did not have, was very poor and they did not have any access to trees, they were having a funeral or a wedding, they would say, they would request permission, and a branch of the would be cut for the use. They never, from our conversations and looking at archival material, they never cut the full tree itself. They would cut parts of it that they could be used for it. And also the tops were a place for gathering for the village. If there was some feast, Shivratri feast or something, the villagers would all gather there. They would bring in food. So it was like a community place for the community to come together as well. And over time, we still see these Gundutopes in several parts of Bangalore, especially in the peri-urban area. But one of the studies that we were looking at, we looked at around 46 villages and some 392 urban commons, what we term them as, in Bangalore, and 96 were Gundutopes of that. Of those 96, sadly, we found that about 90% of them had been converted to other kinds of use. Like it could be like a community bhavan, or it could be a school or something, because Bangalore was expanding.
In a certain
In a sense, it was a common, a bus stand or something like that. But the thing is that Bangalore was expanding, and there was a need for space, and Gunatop seemed to be the perfect thing. But we did find places where some of the topes were still there, and one of them is the place you mentioned, Dodugubi. Dodugubi, when we started looking at it in 2013, I still remember my first visit. It was with Harni when we were trying to decide on the lake field sites. And I was just blown. I was like, what is this grove with these 54 jamun and mango trees? Absolutely huge trees. And and people were actually talking about its use and how they used it in the village. So it was very, very interesting. Of course, that top, we followed it every year till COVID. And for a variety of reasons, the community wanted it changed to a park.
now it's a park now.
Now it's a park.
Oh, wow.
So it's like a very manicured park and everything, but the trees are still there. So they have made the park around the trees. But the character and ethos that was there as a community space with grazers coming in, children coming to play volleyball, that's kind of gone. But we know that if you really look around, even in Karnataka and the rural areas, there will be many such topes, and probably other states too. We don't know what these things are.
True.
But when we look at how historically they have been planted, cared for, it's very interesting, because every top has a story of its own, which some of the older villages, and the sad part is many of the younger people don't even know. This is a top and what was it used for. So it's a very and some of the trees were massive heritage trees that may not get recognized as like a building might get, but very much a heritage site.
And might not get recognized because they're not in a place like Lalbagh, for example, where you do have heritage trees.
You have heritage. But this is very much a part of the heritage of the village. And if you talk to the older people, they'll say, they have memories. I used to eat the mango from the top. We would steal, chili and salt from the house, run to the top and have the mango. So those memories are there with the older generation, but it's fading completely as that generation passes on.
And also, I mean, when I went to Dodugubi, I think this was another visit. I think Dodugubi was also one of the lakes that was part of my PhD field site, right? And I remember going there and meeting some members of the Hakipiki community. So the nomadic communities who were traditionally people who would come and put up theatre performances and things like that. There was also a hierarchy involved that it was considered inauspicious to interact with them. So there would be someone who would give them food and shelter at the top, but the rest of it was there was a lot of belief surrounding the fact that you shouldn't interact with them and so on and so forth. But also they would do these Ramlila kind of performances.
Hakipiki, there's another community. I don't know, maybe the Hakipikis also. But I remember Dodugubi, one of the priests saying that they would be the soothsayers. You're right, they would not be allowed into the village to stay. So they will be given place to stay in the top. And they could come and give their services of soothsaying to the village. So that was another of the uses that the top had providing.
And how these people have now changed occupations into lock making and knife sharpening and lock making and all of that. And so I still remember very clearly how changing ecologies then also mean changing lifestyles and
if the top is not there, where will they even a community like that come?
Exactly. And if this thing for performances is not there, if the value for performances is diminishing in some way, or the space for performances is diminishing in some way.
And people also are now much more interested in other forms of entertainment. Everything is changing in that around.
Exactly.
In the area around, especially Dodugubi and all are so much closer to the city. So
exactly.
Sad also. No.
But so then that again brings me to this thing of silences when we think about heritage, right? Which is ecological knowledge is often not seen as a mainstream component of heritage if we think about it. And I was just curious what you thought about those kinds of silences in the way we imagine heritage.
Yeah, I think it's, yeah, you're right. It's pretty much of a deafening silence when you talk about ecological heritage of cities. And it's no more evident than in any development project where the first demand is to cut the trees, no matter, irrespective of how old the trees are. And if we had recognized the trees as heritage, just like we would recognize a monument, maybe ecologically we would have been a much more hardier city than before, if you look at the green cover that Bangalore is losing. So definitely, whether it is trees or whether it is a lake, we have to have that perspective of heritage, because then there is the hope that we will also value it a little bit more for something that has been there from generation. And the lakes in the city are every single tree, even if it is. I just recently went to the Nallur Amarai Tope, which is one of the really oldest topes, and records say that the trees there are 410 years old. So it's a really, really old tope. And it was in one way very sad to see that the way the place is maintained, or that nobody really cares about it as a living heritage. Here is something that should be treasured.
Yes.
Because of its very existence of so long, and for its ecological characteristics. There's also one small temple which, at least as a build structure, could have been treasured, but that also we found in quite a dilapidated state. So it's true that I think the silence that you're saying in terms of the living heritage is probably what is also in a way connecting to the loss of greenery in cities. We have in Bangalore trees that have been planted from the British times to maybe the 90s by forest officers. But what is heritage? For me, heritage is also, we have the definition of heritage, say a tree, right? It has to have a special significance, a size or something of it. But heritage is also, I feel, something that people have planted with, something people have taken a lot of care to build. And then you can't just let it fall apart like this. It's true whether it's of a building or a green this. So I definitely feel that this deafening silence around ecological heritage, especially in the context of cities, is something that has to be spoken about a lot more.
And so it also reminds me of two conversations I've had just before speaking with you. One was with Meera Iyer, of course, from Intac. And Meera was alluding to the idea of, she largely spoke about, the sort of work that Intac does, which is working with heritage spaces and so on. And she was talking of this concept of living heritage, which is that there's a perception that when we think of heritage, or when we want to preserve or conserve heritage, it has to fall back to some idea of the pristine old, that the original has to be there. But in India, that's not the case, because every time something wears out over the years, there are additions and renovations, but there are also additions and renovations that are sort of reflective of the period in which these structures were built. So you'd have temples with multiple architectural styles, for example. And that renewal and reorganization of heritage spaces is something that's very much a part of Indian culture, and which is very missing in a lot of Western discourses around what heritage should look like if you think about it. So that was one thing that it struck me, and Gunditopes are kind of places like that as well. Or in general, these temples that you were talking about, the small temples.
Yeah, any grove or anything for that matter.
The other thing that I was thinking about was also Sudhira talking to me just now about, Sudhira from Gubi Labs, talking to me just now about, so he had done some very interesting work that I had seen in presentation somewhere, which is he mapped out all the different orders of streams that flow into Bangalore, into the various lakes. And he said that the first, second and third order streams are the ones that are the most dilapidated or built over, or the ones that are lost. Whereas the fourth order and fifth order streams are the ones that survive in the form of Rajakaluves or lakes or streams or whatever. And his thing was, and then he did some more work into it, and he was talking about how he found out that the revenue records place polygons over fourth and fifth order streams, but do not put the same polygons over the first and second order streams. So which means that if you inherit a site, for example, you're free to build over their streams.
Yes.
And then it sort of, coming back to what you were saying about how people value particular things in particular periods of time, right? And I was just sort of connecting those links in some way. So
Yeah. So I think if history for a historian may be done in a particular way, but in a context of the kind of work that we do, which is at the intersection of urban ecology and history,
yeah.
there's really no guideline as such that is available for especially global South Seas.
Yes.
There are ideas of history, there is ideas of the urban, and there's ideas of ecology, but nothing that really engages with all three. So at some point, I remember when we started the work on commons, people used to ask us, oh, commons, but cities can't have commons. Oh, ecology, but where's the ecology in cities? So similarly, now we are saying, where's the history in cities? But there has been an increasing acceptance, and it is, I guess, for a lot of scholars to try and see where is that linkage that is happening and why is it important? Because we have seen how history is such an amazing link to keep people interested in both ecology and
Yeah.
the urban.
Absolutely.
So yeah.
Absolutely. I have students that I teach now at Warwick, and we teach a module called Sustainable Cities, which is essentially looking at cities from different perspectives, from liberal arts kind of perspectives to planning and all of that, and also visioning for the future, so utopia, pertopia, those kinds of things. And one of the lingering questions, I've taught 2 batches of students now. I don't think I should say batches for the English audience. I think they liken it to loaves of bread. 2 cohorts of students. And one of the lingering things that I notice is defining what a city is. And of course, the UK comes with its own particular myths about what a city should be. That is, it should have a cathedral and all of that. But in general, this thing about, can a town be a city? Can a slightly smaller urban settlement be a city? And then you have to explain that a city is all of this.
Yeah. I guess the way to look at it is that some of these classifications will make sense from an administrative point of view, but it may not make sense for us to relate to the city.
Exactly.
So how do we balance that from the perspective of governing a particular area? Okay, these classifications would definitely help and it'll immediately be recalled. But I don't know. I mean, here when we say city in India, we are thinking of large number of people in very cramped places. What comes to mind? But nowhere will, for people I know for sure, will history or ecology come when you talk about
it. Will never.
It doesn't come.
Yes.
Yeah. But as we've been trying to say, and through the research, that it is there, both history and ecology, and linked together as such a core part of cities.
But also then that brings me to this other part of it. So history is produced from somewhere. It is produced around existing social norms, societal divisions, all of those kinds of things. And some of what we talk of as heritage, so while they are important from a very ecological perspective, from a justice perspective, they are not particularly as effective in the sense that they are built on structural inequalities. Caste, gender, who gets access to what, where do they get access to, and so on. And then I'm linking it to discourses around climate. So your COPs or your IPBES and all of these things, which come from a very particular perspective of traditional ecological knowledge and including cultural heritage as a way of conferring urban resilience and therefore climate adaptations and that whole spiel. And then I keep thinking a core component of climate adaptation, justice or whatever is justice. Climate justice is a huge thing. So if you're extrapolating that all forms of cultural heritage, which is how it is portrayed, all forms of cultural heritage inevitably lead up to urban resilience, then what is this bedrock that they come from and how just or unjust that would be? Because in perpetuating cultural heritage, some forms of cultural heritage, you would also be perpetuating systemic inequalities.
Yeah.
Gender, race, class, caste, anything.
But I think we've all become, if we have to call ourselves as aware researchers or scholars, one of the things we have to also remember is that we consciously don't propagate the inequality. We are aware of those inequalities that on which the culture is based on, and we say it outright. So example, when we're talking about the lakes, we've always said that lakes, all the nice things about lakes, how they were built by chieftains and all, but we also mention how it is built on the labor of Dalit and exploited communities. So the thing is that reflection has to be there, and when we communicate it, we say that upfront. But we don't just throw the entire idea of heritage out,
Oh, no,
like
no.
throwing the baby with the bath, the water, that the analogy. So I think it's to be conscious that these inequalities were there, and going forward, if you're doing anything, don't perpetuate those inequalities. For example, lake renovation or lake rejuvenation work. How can you make it more accessible to all communities, not just people who prioritize aesthetics or a particular nature, they want to watch nature. Why can't it be accessible to the domestic help who wants to forage for some greens in the it should be accessible to them. So we should be conscious of it, that lake is a cultural and heritage site. It is an ecological space of interest to certain communities, but it's also a source of livelihood and dependence for others. So how do we promote that?
And then how do we have dialogue that ensures inclusive society, forming
that
link? And which is a challenge, right?
It's a challenge. You just have to keep. It's not easy because sometimes you feel like you are presenting a very idealistic way. But if somebody gave me a lake and said, "Here, I'm giving you this lake, ensure that it is an equitable lake," it's going to be a huge challenge to do it.
Exactly.
But that is where a whole group of people have to come together and do that. Where the collective action part of it comes.
Yeah.
Commons
and so then that brings me to commons and the work that we've been doing outside of this academic discourse in trying to make it more visible to people who are not obviously commoners or ordinary people of the city who are not engaging with the commons as commons, but in theory, but engaging with it in praxis more or less. And so I was just thinking about, you've got a huge trajectory of that. Working with Harini makes you do some of that, at least for myself. But I don't have quite the huge trajectory that you have of visibilizing the commons in various ways. How did that come about?
I think a lot of that credit goes to the students also that we have worked with. Harini, of course, has been a huge anchor in giving the space to explore different things and ideas also to support it. But I realized that it is finally my interest in I teach in the university. There are many students, different kinds of students that you teach. And I know that we do research, we publish a paper, but we also know that, how do I make that student in my class, read, appreciate and feel about the research that I felt so strongly about. And working with students has come about serendipitously for sometimes, and also at times by really recognizing that there's this potential that this child has, and I should exploit it. So a lot of the idea has been that the research that we do, it's rigorously published in peer-reviewed journals. But how can a student sitting in my class also engage with it and also beyond the classroom? How does a person who I talk to, a neighbor or somebody I talk to engage? So that is when we came up with wondering about how do we make research more accessible? What ways can we do it? So for that, one is of course this Gunduthorpe article. We have converted it into an illustrated book for which the students have illustrated the story. And that came about in a very interesting way because we had given an assignment in class asking students on carbon mapping to identify certain trees, write about the trees, and insisted that every student should at least draw one picture, one illustration. And I found that some of them draw beautifully. So I asked them, look, if we give you a field material, if we give you a photograph, will you be able, and a story, will you be able to illustrate it? So that's how the Gunduthorpe multilingual Gunduthorpe book came out. And that became quite, it received quite a great reception because many folks reached out saying we want copies of it. It was sent to all the libraries through Uma Mahadevan, who was then the Principal Secretary for Panchayat Raj and Rural Development. So that was a huge motivating force, the reach. Then, of course, we've done the Commons festivals in...
with my famous bilingual talk, yes.
In Alliance Francaise and in Rangoli Metro, where we are saying that, okay, look, Commons is something that everybody needs to know about, not just us in the research or academic field. So we had the photo exhibitions around Commons. We had Aarti Kumar Rao, who had also done one of the set of exhibitions. And more recently, in the last 4 years, it's been the climate festivals done at a massive scale in the university around the themes of river, forest, mountains, and this year, the coast and oceans of life, where we've now at least reached out, not just in Bangalore, but across cities to about 80,000 school children and audiences, just talking to them about why it is important to talk to them hopefully about things about the environment and climate, that yes, it is a story of gloom and doom and things may be going downhill, but there is still hope because there is so much of biodiversity and ecosystems that are still there in this country and that we need to protect it, and also highlighting the role of communities who are treating all of these as commons and protecting it.
Yeah.
So, and in that again, not just bringing in the science, we brought in culture through the performances, folk performance. We brought in the workshops with different people from different communities, and also art, history. So many things have come together in the climate festivals.
Yeah.
So it's just reinforces what we have been saying, that you can't just talk about ecology without any of these elements of history, heritage.
Yeah.
If you talk to them together, there's greater strength in it.
Yeah. But also I think it's a process of reimagining heritage in that way, because these are children who are going to be citizens of tomorrow, right?
Yes.
Voting citizens of tomorrow.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
what they are carrying with them, so it is sort of, like, oh, when I was in school, this is what
Yes.
I did.
Yeah.
And
this is the living heritage that I want to protect.
Yeah.
In addition to the monuments, yes, fine.
Yeah.
But this forest that some child has, an intern has recorded in some corner of India
Exactly.
is worth protecting because it has these massive trees or certain kind of biodiversity, even if it's a frog or an insect or a flower. That's what we are trying to say. That's the heritage that we want.
That's the heritage that we want to conserve. And so then, I was kind of also thinking about forgetting in the process of heritage making, right? Because we've been talking a bit about how heritage is in the value that we create in the present, which therefore means that certain aspects of the past have been forgotten in order to create the present value. And similarly going forward. And I guess this is more of me also thinking out loud in a certain sense about the role that forgetting then plays in the processes of heritage making. What do we want to forget? Do we need to forget something? Or should we think of preserving everything that was in the past for the future? I don't know.
It's a very tough thing.
Because Rodney Harrison has this beautiful article out where he basically talks about when forgetting becomes important to memory making and cultural heritage making and all of that.
Yeah, true. I mean, it's a very profoundly long discussion that we could have. I don't feel at all qualified to talk about.
I mean, it's more along the lines of your own work, I guess.
But it's very interesting because sometimes I think we have forgotten a lot.
Yes.
And what we are trying to do through our work is remind people of that forgotten heritage or history around, in our case, the commons or the urban ecosystems. But at the same time, we don't want to like the caste elements or the gender elements. We don't want to reinforce. We don't want to forget it.
Yes.
But we want to ensure that it doesn't happen again. Those things are not reinforced in government policies in future.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So maybe a lot of forgetting happens in the urban anyway. And it's a balance between trying to see what to reclaim and what to remember.
And in Bangalore, which is also a city of migrants.
So is it that, okay, each migrant community make their own little bit of heritage where they, like, the lakes in Bangalore are not just used by the local communities. They're used by migrants for their Chhat Puja or Durga Puja. So is that's historical in another place which they have brought here.
Yes. Yeah.
From their hometown, their place that they have got here.
Yes.
And it's created a new thing. So, I don't know. I mean, maybe it is to strike a very fine balance between what should be forgotten and what should not be forgotten.
Yeah.
Which is tough.
And it's very similar to the discourses in the UK, right? Because the UK obviously has got a lot of migrant population.
Yeah.
Indian diaspora quite prominent among them. And water bodies, therefore, because water is sacred to Indian cultures, become not exactly repurposed, but they serve alternative views. Suddenly they get a sacred value, which probably from the pagan societies has not happened since. So you'd find suddenly you'd go down some river and you'd find a coconut or a vermilion or something, which is something that you never think of in a British river, right?
Interesting, yeah.
And so there are a lot of discourses about South Asian migrant heritages and in general the heritage of migrant communities, because they move from one place that they called home and call another place their home.
Oh, yeah.
And what do they bring with them, and how does that enrich the landscape that they come into,
Yeah.
and give them a sense of place, hub,
Yeah.
because integration into a society also means those kinds of things, right? So
True. Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
so it just kind of got reminded of all
I
of
think
that.
each of us relates to it, whether as a migrant, I don't know what to call myself, for example, in Bangalore. Am I a resident? Am I a migrant? Am I a resident now? Because I've been here for quite some time, but I still feel home is where the city I grew up in. So, but I think we don't have to, we can feel home in multiple places.
Multiple
depending on
places.
the-
Yeah. It's the same for me, right? Because
Yeah.
someone asked me where I'm from. Now I've got 3 different things to talk about. I'm from Kerala, but I have lived in Bangalore most of my life. And now Sheffield and Coventry are home.
Yeah. So it's all, as long as it only enriches, I guess it.
As long as I don't pronounce Ragi, we are good.
Yes. Right. Yes. So it's, right.
See, now that is immortalized also.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, I think these were some of the things that I really wanted to chat about. This idea of heritage as being active, living, breathing
Yeah.
components and not some ancient artifact that is.
It's definitely a new way of thinking about what challenging a lot of what we are taught to think.
Exactly.
History is
Exactly.
that up to 17th, 18th century, and after that it is the modern era.
And then you have students come up and say, can I use stuff from the early 20th century or something, or the 21st century or whatever, for as historical material? And you go, okay, are we that old?
Yeah. For them it is, I suppose.
Yeah. So it's that's when the reality hits you that we are actually part of history as well, in as much as we think history is something there. So yeah, it's been lovely chatting.
Like,
Is there anything that you'd like to talk about around these things that I have not prodded you about?
I think you've covered pretty much a lot of the interesting things that we set out to talk about.
Yeah.
So it's really nice that, linking the idea of history, ecology, and the city together, and also how to make it more accessible to whatever we have been different ways of doing it, the importance of doing that, whether it's history or whether it is ecology.
Yeah.
So I think we had a good chat. It's a good.
Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.